Back when I was serving in Montana, there was a local church that was closing down. At some point in time, they had split away from the cathedral, the only other Episcopal church in town. Now, I'm not sure what the conflict was initially about, though I do seem to recall that all of the guilty parties in the cathedral, at least most of them, were at that point dead. Now, the church's rector made a really smart move as they were getting ready to close. This rector asked the dean for the cathedral to come and do a worship service with them on a Sunday and have a chat with the members at that church afterwards. This was an attempt to maybe help convince the parishioners to go to the only other Episcopal church left in town to make sure that their spiritual needs were being met. And if memory serves, none of the parishioners came back to the cathedral. Whatever had happened in the past, the grudge was so deep, it wouldn't even set foot back in the cathedral again. So here's a group that was willing to allow their feelings towards others, allow them to miss out, to keep them from the opportunity of connecting with God, of deepening their relationship with the Lord. They miss out on something so wonderful just because of something a bunch of dead people did way back when. Now, our readings today show the folly of this way of thinking, a way that many of us in the world, and even in the Church Universal, unfortunately are all too familiar with. Being unable to forgive, no matter the slight, can have devastating consequences on us. Take the crossing over the Red Sea that we hear about in Exodus. Now, this event occurs just after what we talked about last week in Exodus, the Passover. The Passover itself being this culmination of the plagues on Egypt. Now, after each plague, Pharaoh had an opportunity to let the Israelites go. And occasionally, Pharaoh would at least think about it before changing his mind. For the most part, Pharaoh continued to refuse. Now, after the Passover is a little bit different. This point in time, Pharaoh decides to let the Israelites go, let them go with their families, even have some things to take with them on their journey. But then Pharaoh once again changes his mind. After the Israelites are long gone, at least outside the borders of Egypt. So Pharaoh decides to take from his army and chariots and chase after the Israelites. Yet God is still there with them. God is still there protecting the Israelites. God has Moses raise up his arms, and the Red Sea parts, making a way for the Israelites to pass through. God also has the angel of the Lord there in this pillar of cloud, preventing Pharaoh's army and chariots from following the Israelites so that they can pass through on this path and get to safety. Now, eventually, the pillar subsides, and Pharaoh's army and chariots make their way to follow the Israelites. But they still deal with other problems. Their chariots get stuck. And it's at this moment Pharaoh's army thinks, you know what, maybe we should let bygones be bygones and let the Israelites leave. But unfortunately for them, it was too late. God has Moses spread his arm out again. And as he spread his arms, the waves come back. The sea comes back to how it was before. And Pharaoh's army and chariots are drowned in the process. They are no more as the waves come back over them. If this weren't a powerful example of the dangers of being unforgiving, we see another one in our gospel lesson today. Here, Jesus presents a parable where a king has a slave or servant who comes to settle his accounts. And after the slave begs for mercy, for forgiveness, really, the king takes pity on him and grants him that mercy. So the slave goes free until he runs into one of his other fellow slaves, someone who owes him a debt. The slave is not merciful. He's not merciful with this fellow slave. He has his debtor thrown into prison until he can pay what he owes. He fails to show the same mercy the king showed to him. And when the king hears about this, he's outraged. He's outraged and remits the mercy that he showed this slave, throws him into prison, where he will be tortured until his debt is paid. He does this because the slave did not forgive his own debtor in the same way that the king forgave this slave. Jesus makes it clear from the get-go that this parable is referring to the kingdom of heaven. He makes it clear this parable is referring to forgiveness. And this should remind us of words that we say at every service when we gather here together. Words from the Lord's Prayer. Words about our trespasses, or as our fellow siblings in Christ and other denominations sometimes say instead, and it's actually better with the Greek, debts. So trespasses or debts. But this is how we say the Lord's Prayer and how we'll say it together today. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. This is the lesson that the king's slave forgot in the parable that we hear today. Jesus also speaks of forgiveness at the very start of this gospel passage. There, on being asked by Peter how many times to forgive another, Jesus tells him to forgive not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. Some scholars say that this should actually read 70 times 7, which those who remember their rules of multiplication will know is much greater than 77. Forgiveness is hard. We've seen this many times throughout this season after Pentecost. The consequences for not forgiving, though, you die. It is why we are to take the time to try and forgive. It's why sometimes we may need to forgive many times, even forgiving for the very same thing, the very same occurrence. This is why Jesus gives us this number. It's not to limit how many times we are to forgive. Rather, it's to show us that we are to forgive many, many times. We also must remember that God has forgiven us many things. We are to act likewise. Now, for every story like the cathedral's breakaway parish and their inability to forgive, there is another one of hope. Around the same time that I was serving in Montana, there was another pair of churches in conflict, just the next big town over. These churches actually had separated. The dust settled on their conflict. They came back together once again. But even as they came back, many members were struggling with what the other members had done to them. Then one day, for this church, asked a young, soon-to-be seminarian to come and preach. Now, that sermon was focused on following God, what it means to follow God's paths, and how we do that. And in the midst of that sermon was a line about forgiving others as God has forgiven us. And after that sermon, after hearing those words, one of the members came up to the rector and said, "Okay, ready to try and forgive them." There's hope that we might look past ourselves and forgive others. There's hope that we might move beyond the self-destructive cycle of being unforgiving. It helps us in doing that if we realize how much we need to forgive, not for the sake of the other, for ourselves, for our own spiritual health and well-being. We also have to remember just how much God has forgiven of us. If nothing else, we should remember Paul's words in Romans today. We do not live to ourselves, and we do not die to ourselves. If we live to the Lord. And if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. If we are to follow God's ways and not ours, we are called to forgive. So even if it takes you 77 times, or even 70 times 7, take the opportunity. Take the opportunity and